Um, it is really a privilege to be able to welcome back many new friends, and for those of you who have been long-term friends, it's a wonderful time to see you again in person. So it's a special occasion for all kinds of reasons, and I want to extend my personal welcome and the welcome on behalf of all of KGI to all of you. So thank you for being here, and we are excited to present a really interesting, fascinating, and hopefully informative program as well. For those of you who are new to KGI, I want you to leave hopefully with a better understanding of what we as an institution do and how we can educate young people to make the world a better place through science and technology and through their what have turned out to be absolutely incredible careers. Whoops, my brains fell out. Okay. As a staff know, they write a script, and I don't read it. I'm getting better at reading, Weaver, and that's helpful. Oh, geez, it's MD. You know, they go to medical school and they get all smart. You know, I'm supposed to treat everybody with respect. With us today are members of our board of trustees, our most influential honorees and their families. We have many alumni. We have our partners, industry donors, industry, and we have donors, and of course, our faculty, staff, and students. So I'd like to welcome everybody here today, all of you. And I can say, since this is the beginning of the official celebration of our 25th anniversary, I just want to make it clear that this is an endeavor of literally hundreds of people. And I have been honored to be part of that distinguished group, and hopefully you will, in the times this afternoon and perhaps later this evening or whatever, get a chance to meet all of them and to understand their passion and commitment, and for me, hopefully, to say thank you for all that you have done and for allowing me to be part of this incredible group. So welcome to KGI. At this point, I'd also like to thank our partners and sponsors for the event. We have Amgen, City of Hope, Genentech, Edwards Life Sciences, Gilead, California Bank and Trust, PAL, the W.M. Keck Foundation, Pomona Valley Hospital Medical Center, Bioscience LA, Sangamo, and Regeneron. Thank you all for your support. I'd now like to introduce and begin the program. I'd like to introduce our panelists and Bonnie Anderson. I'm thrilled to be able to welcome old friends to our stage for the first of our anniversary speaker series. Unfortunately, Dr. Michelle McMurray Heath, originally scheduled for today, could not make it. In her stead, 3 current KGI Boards of Trustee members, Dr. Ross Grossman, Teresia Bost, and Dr. Lydia Villa-Komaroff will discuss biotechnology, applied life sciences, and more. Ross served as Chief Human Resource Officer at Regeneron Pharmaceuticals from 2002 until his retirement in 2013, later returning that role in April 2015 until his second retirement in May 2016. Doesn't look good on a resume, Ross, just saying. Teresia serves as General Counsel at health technology company 54Gene, overseeing legal, compliance, and cybersecurity functions. 54Gene advances the state of healthcare through large-scale discovery and translational research, advanced molecular diagnostics, and clinical programs for the benefit of Africans and the global population. And I'm also proud to say that is a company founded by a KGI alum, Abase Eniabon. So it is a special relationship, if you will. And Lydia is a molecular biologist, an executive, and a diversity advocate, in addition to being the founder and principal of Intercessions SBD Consulting. She is also the chair of the KGI School of Community Medicine Board of Governors. The 3 panelists are joined today by moderator Bonnie Anderson, co-founder and executive chair of Verisight. Bonnie is also a KGI trustee emeritus and a most influential honoree. Please welcome Dr. Grossman, Teresia Bost, Dr. Villa-Komaroff, and Bonnie.
I don't know. I was looking at these seats and I was thinking, what do you think? Okay, we're going to do this. We're very flexible today. And thank you. And thank you so much. I feel like I'm on yoga class and we're sitting on those balls and you're trying to get your inner core strength. So with that, let's kick it off. Thank you guys so much for your willingness to come and have a conversation. I want to start just with the broad obviousness of, coming out of the pandemic, at least we hope we are, and having spent 2 tough years, in the midst of all of it. Yet what came out of the life science industry in terms of diagnostic tests that we can now go to CVS and get over the counter, all of the treatments, the vaccines, everything that got advanced in literally warp speed, if I can use that phrase. I think from a layman's standpoint, it's probably the first time many people ever really knew what a diagnostic test was. That's where I've spent my career, by the way. So I just want to start by asking, each of these people to, give us your perspective on, with the spotlight on life sciences, with all of the contribution and potential for future contribution, what has you most excited about the next wave of what the spotlight could be shined on in life sciences? And why don't we just begin here? And well, Ron, you've got the one other mic, so why don't you start? And I'll share my mic with Teresa. And you're not live streaming this, are you?
I wanted to sit as far away from that chair.
Don't worry, we got this.
Now, the thing that I'm most excited about, given my background, having been in a company that was trying to create new innovative drugs over and over again, and knows how hard that is and how long it takes, it was just amazing to see not only how fast it could happen, but how cooperatively the companies and the FDA work together to not sacrifice safety, but to move things along. And I think hopefully there's some learnings there that can help as drugs continue to be developed.
You stole my answer, Ross. So, but no, I totally agree. I think it was proven that, the drug discovery and drug development process can move faster, and especially for the betterment of individuals and healthcare. And I think, so generally speaking about healthcare, I think one of the things that I was really happy to see, and this is not necessarily life sciences, but I think it's part of the healthcare ecosystem, is the fact that we were able to really fast track telemedicine, right? And ensuring that people had access to healthcare where they were. And I think, the regulators ensuring that they relaxed some of the requirements for the type of platforms that you had to have in order to have a virtual, telemedicine and telehealth session was just incredible. And hopefully those things that were adjusted for that period will remain, because I think that's really important to have as part of the ecosystem.
One of the things that I would say in addition is that when I began my career, it took 25 years to take something that we had done in the lab and bring it to the clinic. That was the production of insulin for people generally. And now it actually did take quite a while to get these RNA vaccines. The basic work had been done 10, 15, 20 years before. And it's important to recognize that that basic work is still critically important in the development of new diseases. On the other hand, with the advent of things like artificial intelligence, now the ability to, we already know, they were published a couple of weeks ago, the structure of every protein that anybody could ever think of in any animal anywhere in the world. And that happened literally in terms of overnight. So those kinds of advances, the kind that we can't predict, are really going to be the most exciting thing, I think, to see going forward, while at the same time, we'll be building on this important infrastructure which has been developed over the past really only 40 years. When I was growing up, these didn't exist. Biogen was a dream in the eye of Wally Gilbert, in whose lab I was. And so I saw that company grow up and these companies appear and become so very important and critical part of the ecosystem that we now can look to make further advances.
I want to come back to the idea of cooperation you mentioned, between industry and FDA and probably academia in there as well. So we'll come back to that a little bit later. I wanted to just add perspective from the diagnostic side, which is sometimes for those of us in that part of the industry, we've always felt like kind of the stepchild to the big spotlight that gets put on therapies and drugs. Most of the money, most of the grants all go to treatments, and many of those treatments are advanced stage patients. But I think when you look around and now see the benefits of patients being able to get access to easy testing, testing on their own, make their own decisions if they have a positive test on what they do to keep others from being, I think this is going to create a whole new ecosystem and a whole new process for how some diagnostics can be done. And I think the FDA maneuvering to have a little faster track and look at post-launch safety. They took a lot of products off the market that got sort of maybe ushered through a little quicker than they should, and they resolved out on the back end. But now as we think about the promise of early detection of cancers and things like that in blood, perhaps what the FDA has learned to be flexible will open up the door to some of those advancements. And I love the telemedicine example as well. That's now the first place everybody wants to go when they need a doctor, right? So let's talk. You mentioned
before we leave that.
Yeah.
Just one thing that popped in, and I'm going to be an optimist and present this as an opportunity. We learned very dramatically, at least in the United States, from our experience with COVID, that it's not enough to have a great product that's free. And that
Yeah.
there are other factors, sociological factors that need to be considered as we deal with issues like this. And I think that's a real opportunity for KGI, for leaders in our industry, to figure that stuff out before rather than in the middle.
Yeah, very good point. So you mentioned
Amen to that.
Yeah. You mentioned the time and the cost and the effort and the incredible innovation and research that's needed to bring innovative therapies and testing to market. And at the same time, we know that often the millions and even billions of dollars that it takes to achieve this creates therapies that are brought to market, but hard to give access to every patient that could benefit. So, Lydia, I'd love to start with you on that. And then any commentary that Ross, you and Teresa have to add would be great. How can we get these innovations to more patients that can benefit, given the high cost and time that it takes to deliver them to market?
Part of the issue, I think, is that it's not really incumbent on only the companies to have this responsibility of how you deliver these things. But companies have an important role to play, it seems to me, in terms of more transparency about the true cost of making a drug, which we don't know. In fact, it's impossible to know because a lot of dollars go into things that don't work nearly as well. So that's one component. And one way to do that, it seems to me, is happening in the New England area, here in California and a few other places, where what's helpful is a consortium, really, a collaborative effort on the part of companies, the universities that are present, even the community colleges and high schools, because a company can't run just on PhDs. It won't work. And so when you bring all of those things together with the government, state and federal, then you have a chance. I think if you don't bring those folks together in conversation, then it's going to be very difficult to get cost into a place where we can get these things out to more people who really need them.
Just to give you some sense of the magnitude of the issue. So Regeneron, now a very successful company. It took us 20 years and we spent $3 billion of other people's money before we ever had a success. So it's really expensive. A large part of that is the cost of clinical trials, particularly big phase 3 trials. There's probably a way to do something about that that doesn't compromise safety, but it's still going to be a really expensive process. My sense is most companies try within the limits that they have to allow people who don't have insurance or to get access at low or no cost to those people. But that doesn't solve the problem, and it's really complex. So I didn't solve it for you guys.
We would have loved to have had Dr. McMurray Heath's response to that topic as the head of bio. Teresa?
I don't know if I have I'm solving it either, but I know, having been in pharma and healthcare for over 20 years, I mean, I think pharma companies are doing their part with patient access, right? Patient advocacy, ensuring that they have, foundations or they give to foundations, and they have their own, mechanisms on how to allow patients who can't afford the drug to get it. But I think here partnership is also important, especially, I have worked in the market access piece side of the business, right? So, working more collaboratively with the PBMs and the payers to ensure that, reimbursement is not, ridiculous for the pharma company, right? But also that there's access to the patients widely through, formulary access and their insurance coverage. So I think a lot of that is really important. I also think there's probably more that companies can be doing with regard to expanded access programs. How do you allow people who've contributed to your research through clinical trials to ensure that they have access to your product, right? They have access, for a certain amount of time at no cost. And so I think those kinds of things could probably be expanded and looked into, especially in areas for companies that are creating medicines that are managing diseases for people who are underserved and underrepresented, right? In those communities as well. Sure.
I think one of the lessons that may have come out of this last several years of epidemic is that, in fact, we did a grand experiment because the clinical trials for the vaccines, there had been relatively small trials. And what we did was start giving it to large numbers of people. And of course, many of the side effects that come out after the drug is released into the general population. So that if we could get it together with the regulators and the companies and the patient populations that are at risk, it might be possible to get some basic safety information with a smaller number of patients and therefore less expensive, but then continue to report on those patients as we roll the drug out into the population. The information will be more accurate, and people make a gut estimate of their risk assessment themselves. We have patients who are clamoring for drugs which may alleviate a little bit, for example, ALS, one of the newest examples of a drug that was just approved when the data is pretty questionable. It's not clear exactly how much it helps, but the patients want to take that risk. They can provide data, and in that case, it will be done because the company and the FDA and the patients have all come together to say we can do this.
So that's a great lead in to the next topic of cooperation and collaboration. I mean, when you think about KGI and the enormous level of collaboration across an industry, and look at the collaboration that took place in the pandemic because of intense need, how can we learn from those things to change the way collaboration is done to get new advances and new innovations to market, both in the therapeutic as well as the diagnostic testing area. We've got government, we've got obviously FDA, but also other parts of government, CMS perhaps, and other payer groups. We've got academia, we've got, companies.
Well, one of the great problems that face us across the world really is the question of scalability. There are small scale things that are happening. We saw it, which was pretty large scale actually, with the COVID virus. But there are smaller examples that are happening all over, and we haven't learned how to scale them. We don't know how to apply them in larger numbers. Something happens to that collaborative effect if you get too big. And that's not at all understood sociologically or in any other way, as far as I can tell. And so it's conceivable that AI, if it's done carefully, which means that there's input from all peoples who might be involved, and you don't get a univision when you develop something, that might help us learn how to scale some of the solutions that we really already have in many ways, but it's on a small scale now. And I think the really big problem that confronts us is, how do we scale these successful efforts that we can see and we have seen happen?
I'd love to hear any tangible examples you all have in AI and how it's being, when you stand back and think of companies like Amazon and others that have really just changed our life. A lot of what they've done in the innovation is built around business intelligence and AI that drives people to order different things because of their interests. And now there's so much talk and so much, so many, articles and things coming out about how AI is impacting medicine. I'd love to hear any examples you have as well.
You're out of luck. However, what I do see, even from retirement and from a distance, is there's obviously a convergence of tech, biotech, devices, and the little bit of consulting I do, the teams now of at least one of the small companies that I'm working with, one is an Apple person who developed something significant for Apple, and she is part of the team that's developing a diagnostic device. So there's got to be that kind of thing going on.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have an example in medicine, but again, healthcare broadly. I mean, I worked for a little while for a company that was a healthcare tech company, and they used AI. They had developed a proprietary AI tool to help identify underlying mental health issues. And during COVID, I mean, it was amazing to help people identify and understand what they were dealing with and what they were feeling was, depression or anxiety, or and so it was really, really instrumental in helping people actually identify that they had, what their issue was, and then get help, like seek assistance and support with getting that resolved. So I've seen it in that area.
I think the tech and digital and devices. Okay, so show of hands. How many people in the room are wearing, their Oura Ring, their watches, their Fitbit, some device that, okay, see, almost everybody. I'd say 85%. And how much of that data that gets fed to you changes your behavior? So my husband used to laugh at me that if my goal was 12,000 steps and that I was at 11,500 when it was time to go to bed, I'd go run around the house to hit that number, right? Because data definitely drives behavior. And I think we're going to see over the next decade a whole emergence of self-data driving different decisions. And that's going to feed into our EMR and how telemedicine can then take our basic data, and doctor's visits and seeing specialists is going to be for more advanced, more complicated things. And maybe that'll help us diagnose disease early. I'm a believer that diagnosing early is what's going to save lives, not continuing to develop therapeutics for advanced late stage patients just to extend their life by weeks or months. And I think over the next 2 decades, I think we're going to really see a lot of this converge and see that impact.
I think that you're absolutely right. And I think that one component that it has been underutilized and under-recognized in all of our fields, whatever we come from, except for you, is the social sciences. In order for these things to work, if we want to make them work on a global scale, one thing we have to understand is why we behave as we do, what underlies human decision making, and why do we make stupid decisions on such a regular basis, which we do.
We have to think about that.
Yeah, we do. Just read Daniel Kahneman's book and you'll see we make bad decisions all the time. But we have to. It's a big data problem. We receive so much information through all of our senses all of the time that we have to take shortcuts. We have to ignore a lot of the data that's coming in. And we don't fully understand how to change that dynamic or how to utilize it. And once we have that piece in place, then I think, science fiction dreams will come true.
Were you going to add something to that? Yeah.
I was going to give a plug for genomics research and genetic testing. As Shelley introduced, I work for a company that does genomic research and genetic testing, primarily in Africans, but for the global population. And actually I guess it was last week, I was at the Illumina Genomic Forum down in San Diego, and excellent speakers. And one of the speakers was the 23andMe founder, Anne Wojcicki. And she was saying, empowering people to know what their genetic history and proclivities are is huge and is really important. But when she started 23andMe, she had so many barriers because people just didn't want people to know like what they needed to do to avoid disease, right? And I think she said it, but another speaker said, unfortunately, the healthcare system in the United States is not built around healthy people, but it's sick people, right? Like when you get sick, then you can call your doctor. But what do you do to prevent disease and to prevent sickness and illness? And so I think, there's something to be said. And I do think that's something that is becoming more and more important. And I think doctors and people are really more aware of that opportunity. Although I think there was a discussion around how do we get physicians to really embrace it and know how to use it and not be afraid of it. So that's the only other thing I would add.
Let's pivot that then to the policy discussion. What policies need to change? We mentioned FDA a little bit, but what policies need to change to allow more broader access of patients to data? Today, patients don't even have all the data that their institutions and physicians might have on them integrated in a way that they can understand. But if patients are going to be empowered to take some level of ownership, then privacy, regulations, all those things come into bear. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Ross, you're over there shaking your head.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complicated issue. So yes, the privacy laws are so arcane that you can't function. On the other hand, people aren't really good about data, so you're going to have to teach people how to.
But Aura and Fitbit and Google Watch or Apple Watches have tackled some of that.
Yeah, agreed. But there's some probably fairly large percentage of the population that doesn't have a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or a whatever. So it's tough. I'll stop there.
That's fine. So but think more broadly too, back to the impacts of the pandemic on policy. And we were talking earlier about, the patent world and some of those impacts.
Well, one of our problems, I think, is that we make a policy and then that policy is very hard to rescind. It's hard to evaluate policy. We don't do it with policy and we don't do it with laws. And part of that is, I think, again, has to do with how human beings think. And also our government, the way we have structured government, most governments, doesn't help that process because we want stability. So we haven't found the correct tension between stability and flexibility. One of the great things about KGI, in fact, is that our students come in part because they're attracted to that idea of flexibility. And so, as usual, as has been the case for generations, our hope is the students.
Always.
I do think, though, I do think that one of the issues, especially around, data and some of these things that we've been talking about, I mean, it takes a long time for laws, right, to be implemented. And then once you have it there, it just stays forever and it doesn't move as quickly as the rest of the, the universe. So, we have this new technology that's being developed, every day. We have, these companies that are developing these new diagnostic tools and products, and the laws just, they don't apply. I mean, as a lawyer, it's hard to sometimes determine, well, this law, it's from 1950, right? When we didn't have these kinds of things. So how do you determine how to apply the law to now a realistic issue that is, has leaps and bounds further than the law? So I think there is that need to have flexibility. And I think we saw some of that during COVID, which we mentioned, where I think the regulators recognized that, there was a need to, and they didn't change the law immediately, but they did relax some of the enforcement, right, on the law so that you could do things that was not in compliance without the risk of, getting fined or worse. And so I do think, and I'm hoping that regulators, CMS, and HHS and FDA are really thinking through, like, how did we successfully get through this process and this pandemic, and what are the tools that we can allow to maintain and remain, or where can we make long-term changes to make sure that there's that flexibility?
I think in diagnostic testing, the breakthrough was, well, first of all, realizing that investment into testing and making it simple, easy, and very accessible was way late in the game. I think that's one of the lessons learned when, the groups get together is we should have been advancing the testing much, much earlier than it did. It finally got there. And now we can do, drive through at your local CVS or Walgreens, go online, order your appointment, get your test, they'll give you your results, and then you can go fly around the world or do whatever you want, right? And I think that, to be honest, a few years ago, it would have been unheard of that you could get a test through FDA clearance and in the market on the shelf at your local drugstore to allow you to go get simple testing. And when you think about it, why not go to your local drugstore for testing? Like, it shouldn't require a doctor's office visit and then you have to go to another lab, a lab specifically designed, for taking your blood or whatever. So I'm really optimistic and enthusiastic that some of these kind of changes are really going to drive the future of how we get diagnosed and then go get the right treatment once you're diagnosed with a condition.
Right. And just to add to that, I think it's raised expectations on the part of consumers now. So
Yes,
I don't think we're going to
indeed.
go back to you got to go to your doctor to get
That's
a
right.
test.
Yeah.
Which I think is good. And probably
Yeah, I think so too.
One of the things I think that happened is that the rules didn't change. The laws didn't change, but laws are written by people who are primarily not scientists, right? And so an enormous amount of law enforcement is interpretation. And so what really matters is the regulations, which sometimes are written also by people who aren't data-driven people. And so that can complicate things. But you can have the same law, and over time, because of the decisions that are made in a regulatory setting or in the court, things change. So for example, if we go back to patents and how you make things accessible, there was a time in this country when a corporation had 3 duties. They had to take care of their shareholders, they had to take care of their stakeholders, and they had to take care of their people, their employees. That changed. There came a time when, through a series of decisions, companies' only responsibility was to shareholders. And then we got into this craziness of worrying about the quarterly bottom line, which is a burden. If you really want to get your stuff out, you can't worry about every quarter. You have to think longer term. But the interpretation of the law changed that ability, made it harder to do so. Not impossible, but much harder. The pendulum is swinging again, and the court cases recently have moved back in the direction of there's really more than just shareholders who have skin in the game for any company. That's a healthy move, and that's a way that you can make what looks rigid less so.
So that's a really good segue, ESG and all of the efforts and focus and spotlights on diversity and social contribution, et cetera. I was really looking forward to having a frank discussion with Dr. McMurray Heath as the leader of BIO, who's put a number of initiatives into movement on diversity. But this group is every group is very capable of speaking to the whole diversity issue. How do we not only, get the therapeutics and testing and everything advanced, but also make sure we're training people from early ages up, and that we have opportunity for all eventually at the leadership levels in these companies. So Ross, you spent so much of your time leading the human resources function at Regeneron. I don't know if this was the topic at the staff meeting discussion back when you were there, but how do you think it's all changed, and what ultimately do you think is going to open this opportunity for everybody up?
I think it's open. So in my time at Regeneron, we went from a few hundred people to about 5,000 people, and most of that growth was over about 5 years. And my main charge from the CEO was we want the best people, go find those people. There are only so many best people in the world, and in our business, everybody is trying to hire those same people from each other. And what we tried to do, and I think with some success, was cast a wider net. One, get really good at stealing other people's people, but but cast a wider net. I had big arguments with people about the notion that all the smart people don't come from 10 schools. And once you kind of break through that barrier and you get good at finding ways to select for people, then it's amazing what you can do. Now I think you see more and more companies who are really focused now on, we still want really good people, but we don't want everybody who looks like me. And to do that, you have to figure out, where can I find really talented people who are different. KGI has done this amazingly well.
Yeah.
Amazingly well. I think one of KGI's real strategic advantages is its ability to attract really, really good students who don't come from the traditional pools of people. And they're going out into the workplace and they're knocking them dead.
And they are well equipped to
and that's a
become the
good way
leaders
to
of the
do it.
future.
The most fundamental problem, I think, is that it's too late to really truly access all of the talent that the country or the world starts with if we start at the college level or the company level. Until we actually get down and find a way to make sure that all children anywhere in the country have access to a first-rate education, we are not going to be as diverse as the population is.
So I would take it from two different angles, I guess. One is, specifically around our industry, right? Pharma, biotech. So the FDA rolled out, the guidance in April of this year, mandating pharma companies to have more diversity in their clinical trials. And so I think that, and so I actually spoke on a panel in the spring with some wonderful women. It was a women in bio conference. But, I found out that, there are some companies who are taking kind of a full 360 view of what does that look like, right? How do you attract more diverse candidates in your trials? Well, as Ross said, you have to go to different academic institutions, different hospitals in different communities. But how do you have people go to those communities? Well, you have to hire internally people who are more diverse, who can connect with and have the relationships with those doctors who you want to now have as your PIs. And as you begin to hire those folks internally, then it's nice for those folks to know that there are leaders who look like them, who are leading the charge. So I think that's one thing. I think we have to look at it as a holistic ecosystem, not just let's target finding more, African American, Latino people in our trials. Well, take a holistic view of it. I think the other thing is, and COVID was really, horrible. But I think one of the other horrible things that was happening in our country during COVID was the racial injustices that we were seeing, right? And we were already home on our computers or on our TV, and we were watching the George Floyd murder. We were watching, Ahmaud Arbery get murdered, And so I think some of the things that have come since then was kind of corporations who were speaking out against that. People were turning their finger on them and saying, hey, well, but what about you? You have, I'm looking at your website and you have no people of color in your board of directors, right? And then states started to mandate, if you're a company that is registered in the state, then you have to have a minimum requirement of women and people of color on your board. So I think all of that also is helping to move the needle to have people in who are diverse in those leadership roles. But I mean, definitely there's more that needs to be done. And I think as long as that continues to really be moved and companies really taking that to heart, I think, the change is coming. But those are two areas I think that we can really focus on to really help that.
All right, our 45 minutes is done. I'm sure you're all pretty glad. I really want to thank you guys for sharing your opinions, your experiences. It's really great.
Hello.
My name is Mary Bessel. I'm a second-year medical device engineering student. My question is, as we're studying and as the recent alums are embarking on their careers now, what's some advice that you have for us so we can be a part of the solution to everything that you've laid out and discussed for us?
Hiring matters. Fill your companies and all your projects with the best people from diverse experiences, because they bring different ideas, right? Data, it's all about data. Involve regulators early and use all of your great training that you have had here at KGI to make sure you get the product definition right so that you actually have a market when you bring it to market. And hire KGI grads. They're very experienced. How's that? Does anyone on the panel have anything else to add, Ross?
Yeah, and it's going to sound like dumb advice, but it's not a dumb advice. You need to go and do the best you possibly can in those jobs, partially because that's how you're going to be successful, largely because that's how you're going to be successful in your jobs. But you're also, and it's unfortunate and it's fortunate, you're also carrying the mantle of what we're talking about here. You're a new generation of students who are more diverse than the generation that you're replacing, and you're kind of setting the bar. So set it high.
Yeah. And when you think about the students that came out of school and created devices like I was pointing to that we're all wearing, they had a different paradigm when they applied their engineering experience than what, people did back in my day, decades ago, that came out of school. So the innovation will just pay it forward because of your everyday experience along with your training. Yes. Question?
So in my role as recovering lawyer, I want to pour a little cold water on all of the cheerfulness that we've seen here. If you take telemedicine, it wasn't the customers who didn't want telemedicine. It was the reimbursing system. They wouldn't reimburse the doctors. If you take home diagnostics or diagnostics that are available, you may remember when they first came out with a pregnancy test, they didn't want to allow people to do it by themselves, right? Because they had to be consulted. The Institute of Medicine 30 years ago said the average period of time between the acceptance of a new way of dealing with something and its presence in the clinical marketplace was 20 years. 20 years. So you'll be 50 by then. Eli Lilly 30 years ago said, the best way we can cut the cost down for producing drugs is to fail much quicker. So they set up teams whose job was not to prove the drug would work, but to prove that it would not work. They were despised throughout the corporation, right? So it was like they came to you, Bonnie, and they said, I know you spent 20 years doing this thing. It's not going to work. Go away now, right? And those people didn't get advanced, right? So part of the problem is, as Americans, we tend to think that every problem has a solution. Every problem doesn't have a solution. You pick diversity in a clinical trial. I was talking to Bob here. Every clinical trial delay that I know of that was extensive had to do with recruiting. If you thought somebody could fog a mirror and they met your inclusion and exclusion criteria, you didn't care whether they were diverse or not. You wanted them, right? So it's not that that's driving the lack of diversity in clinical trials. It's something else. I don't know what it is. And you talk about collaboration. One of the smartest things that I think I saw during the pandemic was Pfizer going to the state of Israel and saying, we'll give you cheap and advanced access to our vaccine if you'll give us the information that you generate from your central system. You're talking about the ability of a patient to take a look at their electronic medical record. The doctors hate looking at the medical records. They despise Epic. They're stuck with it. They got to do it, but they hate it. And the interconnection, how many times do you go to a doctor and you fill out all this stuff? What drugs are you taking and so forth? And then you go to the next doctor and what do? You fill out all the same stuff, right? And you'd be happy to have, I would be happy to have that all available. Here it is. Don't bug me anymore. So what would you say?
Next innovative idea. Did someone write that down? All you students that are going to go start companies? Agree. Yes.
You know, AI, artificial intelligence, is a huge field. Even in the engineering business, when you do construction on multi-billion-dollar programs, we hire AI companies. There are many, many companies in the country. You go to politics, there are artificial intelligence companies involved. In trials, I can't remember the guy's name, in Texas area or someplace, he has done prediction of all the trials so far that he's been given. He has not been wrong in one area because he uses perfect AI, data, intelligence, prediction, so forth, so on. So it's a huge field. I mean, absolutely a huge field. And not only that, companies are putting in AI experts in their company to coordinate with the outside companies. It's growing like crazy.
Really good point. I know Nordstrom's uses it. I think, yes. You gotta come up here. This cord isn't long. You gotta come up.
I just wanted to just respond to the young lady. I think one of the other things that's really important for you all to do as students is go back to your communities, right? Ensure that you are mentoring in your high schools, in your communities, that you are telling people what you do, how you got there, because there's such a lack of information sharing, especially in communities of diverse and underserved people, that they don't think they can get beyond their circumstances. So I think for that's the piece of information I would give you is go back to your community, share with people what you're doing, mentor folks, and help folks know that there's options for them.
What a great wrap.
Thank you all. Please, I'm looking on my Timex. Pretty 19th century. But according to my Timex, we need to take a slight break. But first, I want to thank Bonnie and the panel for a fabulous job and for stimulating, wonderful discussion. I would hope there are refreshments in the Chan Cafe. We'll try to get everybody reassembled in 10 minutes. Because Dr. Lawrence is going to try to defend the medical profession. Please enjoy. There's coffee and drinks in the cafe. Don't listen to orders. I mean, really, this is very, very disappointing. Oh yeah, I got the long version here. Okay, I hope everyone has gotten a little refreshment, and I hope all of the lively discussion I heard is all about the really exciting topics that we were able to talk about just previously. I'd like to have a special honor that we're going to present to KGI. It is a special video in honor of KGI's 25th anniversary. And this is a video that was produced by alumnus Lawrence Medella, a graduate of the Master of Science, Business and Science class of 2018. Allow me to move away.
Circa 1997 marked the genesis. KGI was founded by Henry Riggs, the president. Innovative element, scientific development. Seventh in the consortium. Yeah, we represent excellence like MBS 2000. Reminisce to ever since we set grounded. 535 Watson Drive. Later in 2003, Sheldon Schuster joined the ride. Developed relations, successful negotiation. Rewarded financial support from the Keck Foundation. Years 2006 to 2010 gave rise to PhD, PPC, and PPM. We are the first to converge the biocon along with School of Pharmacy. Got wisdom like Minerva, sharply focused at Oasis or one NIH. You can tell it's more than just intelligence, we emanate. We're innovating, amazing, articulating. The greatness exhibited deep within our DNA translation. Expressive like gene transcription perfectly. Salute our 25th year anniversary.
That was fabulous, Lawrence. That was absolutely spectacular. Thank you. We need to get that on the website immediately. That is so cool. Thank you so much. And I have to tell you, that is probably the best summary of our 25 years I've seen. That's fantastic. Thank you again so much. That was absolutely wonderful. At this time, I want to introduce a dear friend and a colleague and someone with whom I have had the pleasure to work for several years, Dr. Dave Lawrence, the founding dean of our School of Community Medicine. Dave, he was instrumental in developing the school as well as its flagship program, the Master of Science in Community Medicine. This is an online degree, and it is a key degree to educate young people to develop an equitable healthcare system that meets the needs of all citizens, particularly those living in underserved communities. Dave's passion for creating opportunities for diverse populations to pursue careers in health sciences will have long-standing impact on the future of KGI, on our students, and the entire community. It was a real joy to be able to work with Dave, and he tried to retire. You know how that goes around here. And we were able to convince him sort of a month at a time. I want to go on next month. And we wouldn't let him do that. And it was to our advantage, and it has been an incredible pleasure to work with Dave as the founding dean. Always open to discussions, always open to new ideas. We argued, we fought, we yelled. What else did we do? I don't know. Maybe we arm wrestled. But in a way that really, I think, is the height of how academic institutions should work together and look at different ideas and exchange ideas and get the best possible outcome. Before KGI, Dave was the CEO and chairman of the Kaiser Foundation Health Plan and Hospitals. It was there that he focused the nation's attention on the issue of patient safety and the need for reform in healthcare delivery systems. Prior to Kaiser, Dave worked in public health and human services in Oregon. He was on the faculty of the University of Washington School of Public Health and Community Medicine, as well as the School of Medicine. He was an advisor to the Ministry of Health of Chile and was a Peace Corps physician in the Dominican Republic in Washington, D.C. Please join me in welcoming Dave Lawrence.
No, I'm not gonna get on that date. Yeah, that'll work. Okay. I don't know. Okay. Got it now? Yeah. Oh, yeah, ta-da. I can't tell you what a thrill it was when Shelley and Charlene, if I were session. First thing that went through my mind is after 60 years, I've got a lot of stories to tell. And I thought, God, a captive audience for 45 minutes, I can tell stories. And then they came to their senses very quickly and said, Dave, will you talk about some things that are exciting you about what we're seeing in science at this point, in healthcare sciences, the medical care sciences, and the implications for the healthcare system in about 25, 30 years to the year 2050? Well, my first reaction was say, why should I care? You know, I'm old enough that in 2050, it's going to be your problem, not mine. But it was a very exciting challenge, a very exciting opportunity to think about the questions of what I'm seeing and participating in. Oh, good. Thank you very much. What I'm participating in, I'm sorry, that's a little better. Turn this off. The kinds of companies that I'm associated with and have been associated with, and thinking about what the implications are for the healthcare system. It's pretty exciting. And you heard a lot about that in the panel, the very exciting things going on in the drug pharma, the discovery diagnostic area. You also heard a little bit about the difficulties throwing those over the transom into the medical care system, how long it takes. And I'd like to focus on that issue. Let me back up a little bit though. The British immunologist, Daniel Davis, in the book, The Secret Body, How the New Science of the Human Body is Changing the Way We Live, which was published last year, talks about discoveries in several areas. Obviously, in the immune system, the cell system, genomics, the brain, the fetus, and the microbiome were the areas he covers. The issue that's threaded through all of them are the exciting discoveries at the level of the intracellular systems. We talked about genomics. We talked about proteomics. We've talked about the dynamics of what's going on inside those cells. And that's where the most exciting work in healthcare or in medical science is, in my view, and also where the implications for the healthcare system are profound. He says in his introduction, I think it's worth quoting him, and I'll read it if I can get close enough or far enough away to see it. Quote, with so many discoveries on the horizon, today's science fiction may be tomorrow's, I can't see it, I gotta put on my damn glasses. I didn't realize I was gonna have to do this. Okay. Today's science fiction may one day seem naive and simplistic by comparison. I thought it was a wonderful quote about what's happening now, how unique it is in comparison to what we understand. What's going on in the scientific world often is beyond imagination for those who aren't in it. It's really an amazing time. And a couple of years ago, I had 4 students from here who were interns as we were putting together the programs. And they were lamenting this or lamenting that. And I said, my goodness, you're just entering into the healthcare field at one of the most exciting times that I remember since I entered over 60 years ago. It's really a remarkable period of time. I want to talk about the implications of these discoveries in the intracellular mechanisms, because those going on with the combination of the basic science, the computational sciences, artificial intelligence and machine learning have dramatic implications. We talked about clinical trials. Part of what's happening in some of the companies is the ability to simulate in silico what goes on inside the cell. And when we do that with what aberrations are occurring inside the cell or what normal functions are inside the cell, we can throw medication changes or medication options at those cells, at that simulation, in silico, without patients. it's amazing what the implications are for that, for doing away with some phases of the current clinical trial system. It's also a dramatic, if you think about what's happening and think about where we'll be 20 or 25 years from now, and think about how big the hospital systems are, just physically, how big, what the capital intensivity of those places are. Much of that capital intensivity goes for laboratory exams and for imaging, both of which will be obsolete in 25 years. That isn't the way we're going to make diagnoses. We're going to make diagnoses from a small aliquot of blood, from a small dribble of urine. I don't know. That's not right. From saliva. We won't need much. That's the point. Erase that thought. And what'll likely happen 25 years from now is that the person who's worried about his or her health will go to a Walmart or someplace else and drop off a sample. And in a day or two later, get a report back that is more detailed, more specific, more reproducible, and far less costly than anything possible today. All from computers, all from AI. That's going to happen. But what the really interesting thing to me is, one of the two that I want to talk about, is what the role of the doctor is going to be in 2050. And the second thing I want to talk about is how these discoveries will change our understanding of disease causality. Let me talk about the doctor's role first. There's an old joke about a family doctor, Paul, I'll do apologies, family doctor, an internist and a surgeon who go duck hunting. And they're in a blind, and they say to the family doctor, "You go first." So he stands up, he has his shotgun, and this duck comes flying over, and he says, "That looks like a duck." Yeah, and it flies out of range. So he lost his turn. So they say, "Okay, internist, you go." So he gets up and he's waiting, and the duck goes a circle, comes back over, and it said, "I think that's a mallard. That's legal. That could be a merganser. That's not legal. That could be a wood duck. That's not legal. That could." And he goes down the list, and it flies out of range. So he loses his turn, and it's the surgeon's turn. So the duck goes around and comes back. The surgeon shoots it and sends his dog and says, "Take it to the pathologist and figure out what the hell it is." Now, notice in that story a couple of very important things. The first is there is no basic science involved in trying to figure out if that's a duck flying over. We spend years preparing medical students in the basic sciences, and at least a couple of years in medical school stuffing them full of basic sciences on the mistaken premise that that has anything whatsoever to do with your ability to identify patterns. Doctors in practice, not academic doctors, not research doctors, but doctors in practice, become expert in pattern recognition and pattern matching. That's what we spend all of our time on in medical school, the last couple of years of medical school, our residencies, is building a library of patterns that we then match unknowns against. That's what we do. That's what diagnosis is. And by the way, that's what treatment is. We're supposed to use this line of treatment. If that doesn't work, you go to the next one. If it doesn't work, you go to the next one. The problem is that the patterns are now beyond the ability of the human mind to understand, or at least to calculate, to establish, because those patterns are at the level of genomes and proteins increasingly as we understand what is going on at the level of the cell in terms of the human body and disease and health. That's a remarkable breakthrough. It's also an end to a paradigm for the doctor, because we have been trained to be the answer guys. Come to us, we'll tell you what's wrong. Come to us, we'll tell you what treatments you need. But both decisions, diagnostic and therapeutic decisions, we are now beginning to do through AI, through proteomics, through genomics. Now stop for a minute. Lydia mentioned in her comments about Daniel Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow, and also in his book Noise, talks about the limits of the human mind to be a logical pattern matcher and how we establish shortcuts to try and get through that process. Let me tell you a story. I am going to tell a couple stories, but not what I'd originally hoped to be able to do. It's much. A friend of mine, Brent James, was the head of quality at Intermountain Healthcare for a number of years. He's a plastic surgeon. And he tells the story of going to a pulmonologist in one of their hospitals to talk about the factors that the pulmonologist thought about, considered, when he was making decisions about how to manage a patient on a ventilator. So he went through what we all were trained to do as doctors. Steve will know this too. And that's come up with a blurt list of all the possible things we'd need to know, right? He came up with a list of 50 or 60 things that he wanted to know in order to be able to manage a patient. Very impressive. So Brent then asked him, how many of those do you use? And he said, well, these 5 or 6, the ones that I've found, seem to work pretty well for me. The human mind is able, in an analytic sense, to do pattern matching with a very few number of variables. 5 to 7 is about the limit. We were visiting at Kaiser a few years ago, people from a company that I work with called SomaLogic. And we told them at the time, how would you like to have information on circulating proteins in your patients? And the number we had at that time was 2,000. We now have 5,000 we could do on a single chip. And next year it'll be 7,000. By the way, it's $200. There are 20,000 proteins that are considered to be important in human disease. We can now, for $200, identify 7,000 of them with that aliquot of blood and the other things I mentioned. So we said this to the medical director of actually the Care Management Institute, which oversees sort of the standards for clinical practice at Kaiser. We said, you could have all this information about the patient. And she said, we already have too much. We already have more than we can use. Now think of what that means for the patient. All of these pieces of data, some of them could be really important, and they're getting dropped. They're not being used. Now, the premise has been that because of the training of the doctor in bioscience and so on, we could keep up with all that science. You guys in the biosciences have so far outstripped the ability of we physicians and the healthcare system to incorporate that into clinical practice that it's now almost dangerous. We can't keep up. I don't know, Paul, what the latest data are, but when I was looking it up a couple of years ago, something like 70% of the science that you learn in medical school is obsolete by the time you graduate. And the doubling time of bioscience information is about 1.5 years. Physicians can't keep up. But we depend on that information to do pattern matching. So we're falling further and further behind. Now, specialization has been one of the things that's occurred as people have tried to narrow the field that they need to understand. Think about this. In 1950, according to a Pew study, there were about 12 recognized specialties of medicine. Today, there are over 200. Think about this. Also in 1950, there were about 12 support professions supporting doctors. Today, there are almost 300 or 400. It's exploded. And imagine trying to keep up with that. You either specialize or you use your systems for shortcutting using the stuff that Daniel Kahneman and others have identified in their research. It's no good, and it's expensive. The other worrisome thing is that once you leave training, people say when you leave your training in residency, you are at your best as a physician. And from then on, you're playing catch up with the data that's being thrown at you through the journals, and you're falling further and further behind. Study in the Journal of the American Medical Association in the early 2000s actually demonstrated that the older you are as a physician, the poorer your quality, because you can't keep up. So here's the situation for doctors in 2050. What are they going to do if they no longer do diagnosis and treatment decision making? That's been the coin of the realm for the doctor, literally and intellectually. What do we do? Well, imagine, come at it from the patient's point of view. The patient is going to go to Walmart, drop off the sample, get a report. We've all talked about how wonderful it's going to be to have their own data, and all this kind of stuff. It's going to scare the hell out of them. I mean, you're not going to want to find out if you have cancer or a chronic disease that way. It's going to be very frightening. And besides which, most of us don't understand probabilities. And remember that what we do when we establish diagnoses and treatments is to say it's probably a this, like the duck. It's probably a merganser. That's what we do. But this is really advanced probabilistic thinking when you're looking at proteomics and looking at genomics, et cetera. So the report is not going to make a lot of sense, even though the companies that produce them, the diagnostic companies that produce them, are going to work very hard to make the user interface very, very accessible for consumers of different backgrounds. But think about it, if you're a patient, what am I going to need from my counselor, from my doctor, if it's not answers about what my diagnosis and treatment is? Well, first of all, you're going to want somebody who can explain what the hell the report means. That's not the same thing as being a scientist who does that report. It's not the same thing as being an expert in biocomputation. It's an expert in figuring out how to communicate what that report says in the language that the patient will understand and be able to use and act on. What the basic science requirements are for a doctor to be trained to be able to do that are completely unclear to me at this point. But it ain't what we're doing now. That's for sure. The patient will also need empathy. I'm scared. I got a diagnosis that I may have this type of cancer. I've got a treatment recommendation that says I've got to do these things. Empathy is going to be critical. To establish empathy, you have to be able to establish trust. I have to be able to communicate. I have to look like, speak like, and be credible to the person who's sitting across from me. That's a very different way of thinking about the physician's role in the future. That's one of the big implications. There's another. In the 1600s, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, a battle went on between the people who believed that infectious diseases that were killing most people were caused by bad air, and the growing body of evidence that introduced the germ theory. And only in the latter part of the 1800s was the germ theory dominant in that. There's still some people who are germ deniers, but it's a different group, different reasons. They get elected president. No, sorry. But the important thing about that is that with the establishment and acceptance of the germ theory as causative of infectious diseases, it opened up the panoply of interventions that we take for granted today. What we talked about with COVID and the response of COVID is the result of over 100 years of research and investment in research, investment in understanding these infectious agencies and how they work, right? We're on the cusp of another germ theory breakthrough. In 1974, something called the Lalonde Report was published in Canada. It was and Steve knows this well, it was published by the Minister of Health of the government of actually Ontario was who wrote it, but the Minister of Health for the country, Canada, asked for this report. It was called a green paper in Canada. They're a little more progressive than we are, less racist. We call them white papers. So this green paper was the first time that a government established the importance of prevention and behavior as causative to disease. So it talked about in that paper the importance of medical care delivery and the importance of behavior change and of prevention. First time, 1974. Long in the 1980s and 1990s, a person who later became the Surgeon General, who Steve knows well, Dave Satcher, was talking about disparities in health and the wide disparities among different groups in the United States. Another clue. In about 2000, 2001, 2002, a fellow down here in Southern California, actually working out at Fontana Kaiser, I think, named Vince Felitti, published the first study that showed that adverse childhood events were linked to adult chronic diseases. Amazing. Now, since 2002, several other very important studies have come out. In that same year, Michael Marmot, who is a physician epidemiologist from Great Britain, who'd worked in the studied at Berkeley actually, published a book called Status Syndrome, which was a study of the civil servants in the British civil service system. Now, interestingly, what he found is that life expectancy and disease burden were inversely correlation. I'm not going to say this right. Life expectancy went up and disease burden went down the higher up you went in the civil service system. So the people at the bottom were the sickest and lived the shortest. Now, when I was CEO of Kaiser, I assumed I was the most beleaguered person in the entire planet. And I'd come to find out that I actually was really healthy. And it just destroyed my personal sense of myself. I was walking around like this, feeling sorry for myself. It turned out that I was the healthiest person in Kaiser because I was on top. Seriously, that was a very important finding. In about 2010, 2012, the World Health Organization published a series of studies, works, that linked what were called the social determinants of health to 16 healthcare conditions. Chronic diseases, almost all, but not all. And we began to see the rise of something called the social determinants of health. And about that same time, the Institute of Medicine and some of those who were associated with the IOM, as it was called then, were publishing work that said, hey, guess what? When you look at the disease burden in a community, any community, probably 10 to 12% of what you see can be moderated by the availability of medical care. That's all. That just blew everybody's mind. And guess what the major contributors were? Social conditions, environmental conditions, behavior choices, and genetics. In about 2014, in a Public Research Institute paper, 2 public health doctors talked about the need to study the causes of the causes. And what they meant by that was, why is it that social determinants of health, behavior choices, and genetics, how do they work together, first of all? But why do they cause disease? And they said the biological basis for that connection is being established and needs more work. In her book called The Deepest Well, Nadine Burke, anybody can tell me? Nadine Burke Ellis, who has just stepped down as the Surgeon General for the state of California, published a book on her work in pediatrics at a clinic in San Francisco, working with kids who had very high adverse childhood event scores, and talked about A, how you test for that, how you actually quantify that, and B, what kinds of interventions might work to try and change that. In that book, she also talks about the very interesting work going on at the genetic level and the damage that stress, social and environmental and economic stress, place on the genome, the human genome, and the impact it has on the telomeres that sit on the end of chromosomes that are protective against mutations and the kinds of things that happen as a result of those mutations, the chronic illnesses. She talks about that research. And last year, a woman named Lydia Villa-Komaroff, who is a science and health writer for the New York Times, wrote a book called Under the Skin, which is a story of the Black epidemiology, the epidemiology of disease in the African American community, and talks about the biologic basis for why that's happening, not just in a community, but across generations, intergenerational damages to the human biome that occur as a consequence of social conditions, racism, lack of economic opportunity, lack of education, etc. So what the most exciting thing to me about these discoveries is that this represents a brand new kind of theory about medicine, about health and illness. I call it, I've come up with a really silly name. It's called contextual medicine. But we call it social determinants of health. We call it the environmental determinants of health. And for a long time, we've been searching for what the connection is at the human cellular level that explains this causality from the conditions of your life to what happens to you with the diseases that are now the diseases of our communities, which are the chronic illnesses, largely the chronic illnesses. That is a major breakthrough because it's no longer political. This is not an issue that says they don't deserve it, therefore let's cut the cost to them. What we say is a doctor, a nurse practitioner, a public health practitioner, a community medicine expert, all understand we have to go to the causes if we're going to change the health burden, the disease burden of our communities. Now remember, in 1900, when the germ theory was really accepted and built into the US medical care and medical education system, the life expectancy was 48 years in the United States, roughly. It's 78 to 79 now. We've dealt with much of the burden of the chronic illnesses the infectious diseases through the understanding of the germ theory and the application of that. What's it going to take to implement, to act on the emerging biologic basis for understanding why context matters so much in a person's health or a community's health? Well, there are several things. The panel hit on them, some of them. The first is public policy. We've got to put an end to the miasmists, the people who believe that bad air is the cause of illness, the people who believe that the people who are sick deserve it because they're not doing what they need to do. We need to put an end to the idea that the answer to better health, to diabetes, to obesity, is for people to eat better. That's true. But if you don't have access to fresh foods, if you don't have food security, if you don't have income, you can't eat better. If you don't know how to do it, you can't eat better. You've got to put an end to that kind of silly thinking because it stands in the way of actually giving people the kinds of opportunities to live healthier lives. And this is not about a moral issue. It is a moral issue, of course, but this is about fundamental health and burden of illness. It's about economic productivity. It's about the future ability of our children to learn. It's all of those things. So sound public policy is critical. It's an uphill battle. Now, I like the cynicism of my lawyer friend as he brought us down to earth with his observations. But let me also explain this. In a book called The American Healthcare Paradox, Why Do We Spend So Much and Get So Little? A very interesting book I commend to you. It's about 2018, I think, 2017, something like that. Two public health or public policy analysts wrote, and it's got marvelous data. One of the really interesting things that just hit me in the forehead is that in the United States, we invest nearly double for medical care of any other developed OPEC country. The next is Switzerland, I think, at about 13%. We're at 18, 19%, something like that. We also invest half of what those countries invest in the social safety net. Guess what? The social safety net makes people healthier. As we understand the biologic basis that links condition and context to the frequency and the duration and the seriousness of those illnesses, chronic illnesses especially. That's where we intervene. That's where we intervene. So the public policy questions are going to be critical. Housing, education, income security, nutrition and nutrition security, public safety, et cetera. All of those have an influence. The environment, whether or not the water is clean, the air is clean, et cetera. That's not just foo-foo stuff. That's biologic. That is, it's important to health as giving people antibiotics. Second thing is public health. The public health system has been systematically destroyed over the last 40 years, underfunded. People don't go into it. Now, a lot of kids are going into public health and masters of public health. But in terms of leadership, in terms of the kind of things that Fauci has done in infectious disease with COVID, Steve did as Surgeon General, things like that. We're not seeing kids go into that. We're seeing people leaving public health. We're seeing public health departments underfunded. And we paid the price with COVID. We had an incredible response from the pharmaceutical industry, from the medication industry. We had incredible policies and efforts to try and make help the communities be healthier. But we lack the public health infrastructure. And the other things that we're missing because of that is our ability to surveil, to track, to build the data systems that allow us to tell what's going on so we can intervene effectively have been compromised. I mean, imagine a situation in which the number one cause of children's death, which is guns, we couldn't even collect data on guns for 30 years. That's dumb. I mean, it's wrong from a moral point of view. I mean, I don't want to understate the moral issues here. But it's so dumb from a healthcare point of view and an economic point of view. Give you an idea of how dumb it is. Parkland Hospital. This is a completely, I'm jumping around. It's really fun. Sorry about this. But Parkland Hospital in Dallas is one of the largest public hospitals in the country. It competes with LA County, that sort of hospital. Big hospital, big Medicaid uncompensated care population. They spend nearly $1 billion in the hospital care of what they call frequent flyers, homeless and mentally ill people who they pick up on the streets with their chronic illnesses, and they stuff them in the hospital. They come through the emergency room. They stay in the hospital for long periods of time. They put them back out in the street, and then 6 months later, they're back in. Frequent flyers, they're called. The dollar cost of that is enormous. The cost on staff is enormous. The cost on access for the people who aren't in that category that's enormous as well. So as an experiment, what was done was to put a small village around each of those people. Social work, transportation, nurse, health educator, an empathy, kind of a counselor. And guess what happened? For 1/4, 1/6 of the cost, they were able to keep people out of the hospital, get them jobs, get them into housing, get them productive. They invested in that in order to avoid the kinds of costs that are occurring downstream from these frequent flyers. So public health can help a great deal. But the last thing that's been missing, think about how many communities refused masks in COVID, refused to get immunizations, vaccines. Think about why. Some of it was political, obviously, but a lot of it was distrust. I'm a white guy. I go into a black community. I say, trust me, get these vaccines. The first thing that goes through their mind is Tuskegee. I go into a Mexican-American community and speak English, and they say, no comprendo. I don't understand. What are you talking to me about? The proportion of black and brown students going into medical school since 2000 has actually dropped, in spite of the numbers going up. They're more, but the proportion has dropped. The data are irrefutable. Black women who are pregnant and give birth with a Black physician have better outcomes. Stands to reason. Trust and ability to work at the community level is the missing link in all of this. We can do the public health stuff. We can do the public policy. We can train doctors in the social determinants of health so that when they see a patient, who, by the way, is the numerator, in the denominator is a community, they are seeing just the tip of the iceberg. They can be trained in how to understand context. But where the rubber meets the road is at the level of the community. And that requires people who come from those communities. That's not an argument that's a moral argument for diversity, though there is a damn good one. It's saying we ain't going to get anywhere in improving healthcare until we do this. This is a pragmatic investment in the future of the country. Now, the whole purpose of the program that we built here with the help of many of you who are in the audience was to provide the first group of trained people who had the expertise to go into the communities and came from those communities to begin with. I think it's an important first step. There are skills you have to have. There's knowledge you need to have, but there's also the capability of building trust, building empathy, understanding how to mobilize a community around the issues that are of importance to them and are limiting their ability to be healthy. There's plenty of examples of when that happens, how effective it can be. So that's what I'm excited about with the science. It's no longer a political argument. It's no longer just epidemiology that has the linkages between social and economic socioeconomic and environmental factors contributing to healthcare being linked to the adverse outcomes. The early ACE studies were just that. They were epidemiologic studies, which formed the first basis for understanding that connection. But now we're getting the biology of context. And that's a new approach to understanding illness. And to me, that's one of the most exciting breakthroughs that is going to be the result of what's happening now with the kind of science that you heard about in the panel. The kind of science that's going on here. It involves all the things we talked about, being able to understand what is happening at the level of the gene and the protein, the computational capability to understand how to crunch those huge numbers and understand what the patterns are that emerge from that, make sense of those numbers. That has enormous potential to make our healthcare system far more responsive, far better, and importantly, much less expensive, because what we do in the United States is indefensible from a public health point of view. 98% of what we invest in the United States goes to take care of people who are sick, not to keeping them from getting sick. We do a great job of that. We're good at that, but we've missed the boat on all the other kinds of things. It has to move away from being a political argument, as it has been for the last 300 years in the country. This tension between income redistribution, no income redistribution. Who's good, who's bad, who deserves it, who doesn't. That's at the basis of many of the battles we've had politically. We have to move it to a discussion about how we create a community of health, communities of health. And as our communities grow increasingly diverse, as they are in the United States, right to the west in Los Angeles, when I looked at it in 2010, I believe it was, there were 175 different languages and dialects spoken in LA. Newspapers, ways of people communicating. Imagine me going in there and trying to talk to them about public health or about how to organize their community. Can't do it. And we can't train everybody with every language. We can't pick all those people, but we can sure do a heck of a lot better, than we are now. So let me close with a thank you. I haven't had a chance to really thank the people who have meant so much to buying the notion of creating a college, a school of community medicine. Shelley is the first who deserves a huge amount of kudos for supporting that idea and shifting from what is a very attractive idea on the surface, which is to create a new medical school. Yolanda had worked for years as the chairing the group to come up with the argument for why we needed a new medical school. But we shifted the focus, and we shifted it to focusing on what KGI can do well. And that is to prepare people who understand, because they come from and are also trained in context and the sciences that are relevant, and have the capacity, whether they choose to or not, to go back into those communities and work effectively in those communities, either as specialists in those communities or going on into further education as doctors or physician assistants or whomever. So Shelley, thank you. You stood up big time. Really did. And as Shelley said, he and I fought like mad. We are very dear friends, but gee whiz, he's a tough wrestler. I'll tell you, yeah, this was, and dirty. I'd also say, hey, he's dirty wrestling. Hey, he fights dirty. And Jim Whittegren, as chair of the board of KGI, has been a real supporter all along through this long journey. And I thank you, Jim, for what you did. You understood, you supported, sort of. There were times when you scratched your head a little bit, wonder what the heck we were talking. Yeah, he was a full-headed guy when we started this thing. Lydia, thank you for chairing our Board of Governors. It was so wonderful to have you as a counselor, and Steve, to have you on our Board of Governors. It was just wonderful, along with Yolanda from the Board of Trustees of KGI. Bob Curry, I talked to early on and was one of the early people to convince me to get involved with KGI. There are many of you here who have been on the faculty and have helped us put together the curriculum. And I'm not too many to name, except for one. I think Anastasia's here. Where's Anastasia? Is Anastasia Leviton here? She left. Oh, okay. Well, forget the thanks, Anastasia. No, Anastasia worked with me on the early stages of the curriculum, especially when we were putting together the basic science of the portion of the curriculum for the master's degree. And lastly, I'd like to acknowledge Cindy. Cindy is the new dean of the School of Community Medicine, and wonderful. There you are. There's Cindy. Cindy Martinez is just, and brings the kind of understanding and gut level experience, as well as an academic perspective, to be able to take this program to a whole new level. So I just can't thank all of you enough for helping clarify our vision together, and for taking a flyer on something that I think is crucially important to the next 25 years. It breaks with the past and breaks with a lot of our assumptions about the past, but I think does so in a way that makes considerable sense. Thank you.
He lies. I think they liked it. Yeah, who knew? I think they liked it. They quite okay. Yeah, they. Let me just say that this was a wonderful team activity. We had so many wonderful people giving ideas. The leadership from the board, from Lydia and the Board of Governors, and everyone in the faculty and on the board, and Dave was absolutely relentless in getting opinions and information and data and understanding that he brought and that he added to the discussion. And yes, we wrestled, yes, we debated, yes, we argued, but I think we would wholeheartedly agree that the product was definitely worth it, and I was just thrilled to be able to work with you. But I will say it's more fun to work with Cindy than Dave. But anyway, much nicer. I think we have just like 3 or 4 minutes for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Anybody have any questions for Dave? Go ahead, please. Identify yourself. Come on, I know who you are. Go
Uh-oh,
Yeah.
you're beyond my pay grade. I'm just an MD.
So one of the things that you talked about was connecting the new deep science that's all going on to this community approach that we're going for. So I think one of the issues that I know of, Eric Topol, Scripps Research Institute, talked about how AI is going to really strongly change the way we do medicine and change the role of the doctor, like you said. How soon does medicine change toward these things? Because medicine is a notoriously conservative group that slowly, not conservative politically, pardon me, but slowly changes over time, like you said. How do we catalyze that change?
Well, part of what I did when Shelley asked me to take on the deanship was talk to about 40 or 50 deans of medical schools. And the question I asked was, how is the role of the physician going to change in 2050 from the current role? And to a person with the exception of Lyons over there at CUSM, they said it's going to be the same. What we need to do is figure out how to pack more science into the curriculum so that they're better prepared to do the stuff that we've always wanted them to do. Absolutely stunning. Now, a few people, and I don't want to overstate it, but a few of the deans really were talking about making changes around the edges. The question is really top of mind for me because it strikes me that until we change the way we select people coming into medicine, not that there are bad people going into medicine now, but the way we select them really tends to favor people who come up through the traditional STEM background, through the basic science background, and are not necessarily, they do sometimes have, but not necessarily chosen because of the kinds of characteristics they're going to need in this new world. I don't know how we change that. Honestly, that's why we wrestled with that question for several years. Paul is trying to change that at CUSM. Schools like UC Davis are changing some of their admissions criteria to try and get better at selecting people from these different backgrounds and put less emphasis on the basic science performance. It's going to be a battle, in all truth. I don't want to sugarcoat it. You know, in July, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal wrote a scathing editorial about how medical education was going woke. It's one of the dumbest, most offensive editorials of many that the Wall Street Journal has written. And the reason it was offensive was the comment at the end of the article was, we ought to get back to the biology of medicine and stop with all this social science crap. Actually, they didn't use the word crap. Excuse me, that was me. That would have been edited out by Wall Street Journal. But the point is, it is biologic. That's my point. It is biological. It's not foofra. It's not woke. It is, and so we've got battles to fight. My hunch is, and Paul and I were talking about this at the break, the way family physicians are trained and the kinds of family physicians that we would like to have in the future, who are much more about counseling, much more about helping people make decisions as partners, much more about empathy, that is a model for the future. Now, what the science is that underpins that so that they can also be interpreters of the data, we still don't know, as I said. We've got a lot of work to do before you're, the kind of brave new world that I'm talking about and that you're lamenting, not lamenting, but wondering about, is going to happen. It's a tough slog. Yeah, it'll help. Yeah, I think that's true. I am always reminded, though, I can't remember who said this, about the 20-year hiatus between the arrival of science that's established and incorporation into medical practice. The H. pylori case is a classic one where it was first discovered in the early 1980s, rediscovered in the United States because it was poo-pooed because it came from Australia. But it was rediscovered in the United States in the late 1980s. And in 2000, I believe, a study of family physicians, gastroenterologists, and internists found that was still not being included in the differential diagnosis of any group but the gastroenterologist. It just takes a long time. The diffusion of innovation, all these wonderful things we're doing, very slow into the current medical care system. It raises, I just want to say one thing about the medical care system. Remember that the model that prepares medical students is 12 years old, 112 years old. It was first laid out by Flexner in 1910. We're training almost exactly the same way today that we did then. Now, different science, different content, but the same basic model. The model of doctor practice is the same as it has grown up to be over the last 100 years. So we've got a lot of inertia that has to be overcome before this different approach begins to really take seed, in spite of the evidence.
Identify yourself, Curry.
Bob Curry. Given particularly the various works that you cited over the last 10 or 15 years that link sort of socioeconomic trauma to actual biological implications, is any of this data and input really starting to take hold with our friends over at HHS?
The answer is yes. The idea of the adverse childhood events is now part of the lexicon. We talk about that. The biologic basis of it and the ability to screen for it is something the American Pediatric Society, APA, American Pediatric Association has incorporated into some of their guidance to practicing pediatricians. What Nadine Burke-Ellis did was to develop a questionnaire that allowed for quantifying what the exposure to ACEs is. You get an ACE score, basically. So that's now being included in screening in pediatrics now. The interventions are a little more difficult because still the biologic basis is being discovered as we speak. So whether we can get to the point that we have the sort of chronic disease analog of vaccines or of medications or of interventions that are immediate like that is anybody's guess. We're just starting down this pathway. But she at least has identified some interventions that strengthen the capability of families, of parents, to actually deal with those adverse child events and some of the pressures and stressors that they're under. Because remember, it's a real interplay between the parents and what's going on with them and the children being brought up. So helping parents deal with addiction, with violence, with with lack of income, with housing insecurity, all of those things. You can only go so far saying be tough. Because there's some things you got to really do to try and change those conditions. So that we're getting there, Bob, but it's going to be a while.
Let me just, before we thank, obviously there's nothing to discuss, but I would love to invite everyone to stay longer. We are going to have a great opportunity to talk and discuss. But I want to just say one thing to Dave, and that is he doesn't admit to being a scientist. But the truth of the matter is we were doing an experiment. And I want to say that we were doing it. I mean, if you want to know what innovation is, it's experiment when you don't know where it's going to end up. And I want to say that the inspiration for thinking about it as an experiment came from Art Riggs. I called Art, who was a great supporter of the journey of the experiment. And I said, we started out looking for a gold mine and we found diamonds. And he said, that's what a good experiment does. You don't know where it's going to go. And the most exciting and interesting ones are the ones you set up where you have no idea what the outcome is. So I think, Dave, we'll make you an honorary scientist. And I want to thank you so much. I want to just, again, as we spend now time just to socialize and chat, I want to just make sure everyone understands this is the first of our anniversary series of speakers. It is going to be going on during the rest of the entire academic year. We will be giving you details about the times of the future speakers. We have some really wonderful speakers who lined up. Let me just give you a couple of the highlights. First, Dr. Kiana Aran from here at KGI, who's the world expert in using CRISPR on microchips and getting analytical data out of it, received an enormous amount of global acclaim for her groundbreaking work. Dr. Steve Galson, our trustee formerly of Amgen, and at least as importantly, Surgeon General of the United States. Dr. Jeremy Levin of Ovid Therapeutics, Dr. Rebecca Richards-Cordum from Rice University, who because of her work in low-cost medical devices is known actually as the mother of Malawi. And we're going to be ending it up for the end of the academic year, but there'll be more in between, with Dr. Marcia McNutt, who's the president of the National Academy of Sciences. So it's going to be an exciting series, and we want to really invite everybody to stay tuned, be involved, and again, thank you for joining us on our 25th anniversary.